Thank you, Melissa. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's very good to see you all here today. It was a beautiful day that we have. Yesterday I was out walking a local trail we have by the Brandywine Creek, and the leaves have changed color, and in the sunlight they were absolutely stunning. It was a wonderful hour where I thought of nothing else but the water, the leaves, the wind, and the leaves, God's creation. It was an amazing time. Highly recommend it. Get out there if you can. So now, I was struck and pained by a story this week from a longtime friend of mine, Don Ing. He shared his story of citizenship this week. You see, his dad became a citizen of the United States by fighting in and bleeding for the United States during World War II. His mother was not yet a citizen when Don was born. Both of them were from China. But Don was born into citizenship in Boston, Massachusetts, right across from Fenway Park. And yet to this day, people would ask him, because of the way he looks, they say, where are you really from? And he says, I feel that despite my accomplishments, he's now a retired pastor, but pastors never truly retire. He was once the head of American Baptist Churches USA. He's a father, a husband, a friend, a faithful guide in life, one of the wisest men I know. He says, despite it all, I still feel I have to keep my head down. But I don't want to draw any attention to myself and potential ire from people who don't know me. But we're going to deal with another immigrant today. Someone born to a suspect nation, who moves to a volatile, dangerous nation, and is held up as an example of faithfulness, loving God and humanity better than most. Israel was in really bad shape during the period of Ruth's story, the time of the Judges. Israel had slipped badly religiously, morally. They had fallen into idol worship and violence and civil war. They had turned their backs on God and become a violent people. And a local famine befell them. This happened a lot of times in the old world, where one area would be plagued with famine and people would have to go somewhere else for a time if they wanted to eat. And the local famine drives Elimelech, his wife Naomi, their sons Mahlon and Chilion, out of Bethlehem. Because the Bethlehem, the name means the house of bread. But there wasn't any in Bethlehem at this time. They went off to other lands, searching desperately for food. They ended up fleeing to the country of Moab, which was a surprise. You wouldn't expect an Israelite to end up in that land. Because Moab was seen by the Israelites as a place that was not to be trusted, a place with a troubled history, a place that was, while from the lineage of Abraham, well, it was from a suspect lineage because it was from the line of Lot and his daughters. They were looked down upon by the Israelites, and later they would be conquered by King David, who would force the soldiers who had been conquered to lie on the ground, and they would measure off 2 cord lengths and execute them. 1 cord length would be spared. And those who were spared became servants of Israel, required to pay tribute, the entire Moabite nation. The Israelites, even in their degraded state of the Judges era, viewed the Moabites as decadent, abandoners of the faith, and idolatrous people. Yet, this Israelite refugee family went to Moab and was welcomed there. Their sons would take Moabite wives, Orpah and Ruth. But they would find despair there. It's a moving story. Father Elimelech would die first, widowing Naomi. 10 years later, her sons Mahlon and Chilion would follow him into death. Naomi would have to bury them all. At this point, she's a widow and she has no children. and neither of the couples had had children either. Naomi was widowed and childless. There was no one to support her in a male-dominated society where basically marriage to a man was what kept you alive and well in that period. None of this was hers, and she was far away from any extended family, so she couldn't find help there. But in her grief, Naomi discovers that God has lifted the famine from Israel. Bethlehem has once more become the house of bread, and a decision must be made. Naomi decides that she will return home, not out of fear of her Moabites neighbors, they had treated her well, but perhaps to leave behind the painful memories of the men she had lost and the questions that left in her mind. And she would head toward an uncertain future in Israel, her home, despite all its faults. Her daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, declared that they would come with her. This is an example of love overpowering the suspicions of nations of each other. Love overpowering rumors about different people. And the two Moabite women declare that they will return with Naomi to Israel despite the risks, despite a nation in turmoil, despite the suspicions that would be leveled against them by the locals when they arrive. Three women without power in society, and yet they come up with a plan and they decide to commit to it. But then Naomi has second thoughts. She remembers being an outsider and a refugee, an immigrant to Moab, the struggles that she had, the unfamiliarity of the culture, the different ways that people did things, the different expressions they used, and how confusing that had been for her, even with family. And she didn't want to bring her daughters-in-law into that. And so she tells them, stay in your own land, go back to your mother's homes, find new lives. You're young enough to remarry. You can have children. Things that Naomi was painfully aware that she could no longer do. And she admits, I have no way to provide for you. Go home. Naomi sees no men in her family who could pick up for her dead sons, marrying Orpah and Ruth, as was custom. No one to give them stable lives. It's a painful moment where they're all reduced to tears. The love between them is evident. Orpah agrees reluctantly to go, but Ruth insists that she will stay with Naomi, never once mentioning the uncertainty she would face as a widow, declaring that where Naomi would go, she would go. The faithful Moabite immigrant states where you lodge, I lodge, where your people will become my people, your God, my God. Ruth is willing to jettison her past to set aside familiarity of her own country, the place where she was born. She would set this aside for Naomi. She would trade the gods of her childhood for the God of Israel. She would leave behind any potential for a new marriage, for a shaky future, where the prospects were dim. She would leave a land that was friendly to her people for one that was suspicious of her. But it's interesting, when these stories are passed down and written down, sometimes bits and pieces are left out. You want to shorten it, streamline it, get to the point. And some scholars say that Ruth is responding to statements that were made by Naomi, her mother-in-law. Naomi said they believe that Jewish women, they said they don't go to the theater and they don't go to circuses. And Ruth responds, where you live, I will live. Or where you go, I will go. Naomi says, you don't live in a house without a mezuzah over the door. She says, where you live, I will live. Ruth declared, your people will be my people. I'm giving mine up for yours. And your God will be my God. Placing her faith in the God of Israel, the God of people who had long looked down on her. In a faithless age in Israel, an age of civil war and religious wandering, Ruth the Moabite, the outsider, the foreign immigrant, may well have been Israel's most faithful person. Ruth, in faith, moves forward, ignoring the uncertainty of life, ignoring the animosity of the foreigner she would live among, ignoring the fear of the unknown, of this potentially violent place. Seeing full well that Naomi has nothing to offer her, Naomi will actually change her name from Naomi to Mara, which means bitterness. And she is bitter over the losses she has felt. She felt that God dealt with her bitterly. But Ruth insists that she will attempt to stand up for this defenseless older woman. Even though she herself is husbandless and considered powerless, she's going to step into the gap in faith and defend Naomi. In faithfulness without a male protector, Ruth will go out into the fields to glean barley during the early harvest season. Even though Israel was now a place that was not safe for women to go out and do this, they were being attacked in the fields. Still she went. Her faithfulness superseded her fear. In faithfulness, Ruth undertook a selfless commitment to her mother-in-law in a foreign land. According to an article in Christian Century, a study from Harvard finds that Ruth's faithful approach to life is actually a key to happiness. It says there are 6 things you need to do to make life happy. Avoid addiction, have a happy childhood, meaningful relationships, loving relationships can actually supersede an unhappy childhood, coping skills, and living a well-rounded life that includes giving back to society. Now, I can't speak to Ruth's childhood, it's not written, or her avoidance of addiction, but she loved Naomi well. She had great coping skills in the face of tremendous adversity, and she lived a well-rounded life that included giving back to society abundantly. In fact, she became an example of great faith for all of Israel. She stood up for Naomi, and spoiler alert, she would go on to marry an extended family member named Boaz. And together, Ruth and Boaz would be the great-grandparents of the greatest king that Israel ever knew, King David. And then the greatest king of all time, she is one of 4 women mentioned in the direct lineage of Jesus Christ. So Ruth gave back immensely. This is a terrific way to move toward happiness. All based on her powerful, determined faithfulness. And it's a guide for us today in the tumultuous world we live in. It's not all that different from the Israel of the Judges. Let's follow Ruth's example. Let's be faithful and determined. Love God, love neighbor, all of our neighbors, and no matter what land they might come from. In faithfulness, we will discover the key to happiness and to great joy. Let's pause for a moment of silence. Amen. Ruth 1:16.